Hi everyone, I'm Matthew Janda for Card Runners, and today we're going to be learning how to 3-bet with shallow stack depth. Goals for this video: we're going to try to get a better understanding of how calling and 3-betting ranges change in the big blind based on the opening size and stack depth. We'll talk probably a little bit about calling, but we're mostly going to emphasize 3-betting. We're also going to emphasize stack sizes 35 big blinds and lower. I've talked about it in other videos, but really I don't think ranges change all that much when you go from being like 100 big blinds deep to 150 big blinds deep. Where you really see ranges change drastically is as you get shallower. And we're going to use Snowy as a tool to help us with this, even though we can't take into account antes or multiple bet sizing. So I'm going to be using Snowy a lot off screen to kind of see what it has to say and seeing if that can help us. If we have time, I'd also like to get a better grasp of how the 3-bet calling range changes based on the size of the 3-bet jam. I'm not sure we'll get to that, but I would like to. All right, so how do big blind calling ranges conceptually change as stack sizes change? Right, so let's start this video off with a question. As stack sizes get smaller, how should the big blind calling range change? And most importantly, should the calling range get wider or tighter? So pause for a moment and think about this if you don't already know, because I think it's super important. As you have less stack depth to play with, should the big blind call with a wider or tighter range? All right, once you're done pausing, wider. It's easier to realize your equity as you can't face large bets. So in other words, one of the things that makes calling in the big blind so difficult, even when you're getting a great price pre-flop, is it's hard to realize the equity of a hand like King 8 offsuit if you know the button can know you're weak and make really large bets on the flop or the turn or the river once you've called and he knows you can't be strong. That's not really possible if you don't have the stack depth. All right, so should we emphasize robust or non-robust equity hands when calling and open in the big blind? Again, pause for a moment and think if you don't already know, but it's non-robust. We can't win much money when we make the elusive straight with 6-5 of diamonds, but pairs with King 8 off are now pretty good because there's just, again, we can't face those large bets, and making top pair with a weak kicker or middle pair with a good kicker is actually a pretty good hand if you're only 10 or 12 big blinds deep. Small 3-bets with very shallow stack depth. Small 3-bets with very shallow stack depth don't make sense. We're usually dealing with wide ranges, cutoff versus big blind and such, and every hand just has a ton of equity pre-flop. We don't deny equity well with super small 3-bets, and our opponent can jam over our 3-bet, and we almost always have to call. So we're better off just jamming ourselves. So you don't want to give your opponent an extra free option. So if you're ever 3-betting so much of your stack that you always have to call when your opponent jams, you'd be better off just jamming yourself. Because by 3-betting small, you allow your opponent to call or go all in which case you'll have to call if he goes all in. Whereas you're better off if you just go all in yourself, because now the opponent doesn't have the option to call that small 3-bet and get that awesome price. So, how big do stacks need to be before we stop just jamming when we 3-bet? So this was the question I was most interested in when I made this series. I wanted to know, how deep do we need to be where we actually need to make small 3-bets rather than just go all in? So if we're only 10 big blinds deep and the button min raises, I know if we're going to 3-bet from the big blind, it's going to, of course, be all in. But I wanted to know, how deep do we need to be before now it's not really good to 3-bet all in? We actually have to start making small 3-bets. So I do not know. I'm writing this slide right now with no idea and about to go play with Snowy to hopefully figure it out. Again, Snowy is restricted on bet sizing and can't do antes. So Snowy doesn't have an answer for this, but I do think it's a useful tool. So, I wrote this in the past, so I actually have already looked at this by the time I'm talking. But yeah, I totally didn't know this when I made this slide, and I thought it'd be really interesting to find out. And I was guessing it'd be around 20 big blinds against a min raise with no antes, which is a lot deeper than many players seem to think is correct. So I've talked about this with some tournament players, and tournament players seem to be a lot more on board with making small 3-bets with shallow stacks than I am. So I guessed, starting off, I was guessing you'd want to be around 20 big blinds before you still really start opening up the possibility of 3-betting to maybe 4.5 or 5 big blinds. But honestly, I probably would have guessed even a little bit more than 20 big blinds. So even for 18 big blinds, if we 3-bet to 5 big blinds and get jammed on, it'll be 13 big blinds to win 23.5 big blinds, and we need only 35.6% equity, which is really easy to have. So we're not going to spend too much time worrying about the math in this video. I'm kind of just going to present what I found without showing too much of the math. But hopefully you can see, if you're only 18 big blinds deep, even if you make a really small 3-bet, you're getting such a good price on calling your opponents all in that you realistically can't fold anything that you would have 3-bet to begin with. It's not very hard to have 35.6% equity, especially against wide and weak ranges. All right, so what did I find when playing with Snowy? It got kind of messy because, again, you can't do antes. And there was some other stuff that was kind of messy that we don't need to go into details about. But for the most part, Snowy always made pot size 3-bets against a button min raise. Again, there weren't antes, and didn't really start folding to the 4-bet jam until about 27 big blinds deep. So I've already been told I've been 3-bet jamming too deep, but it looks like I should be doing it even deeper. So this probably seems a little bit messy here, but all I'm saying is, for all practical purposes, when I put different stack depth into Snowy and the button was min raising and the big blind was 3-betting, basically as long as it was 27 big blinds or shallower, the big blind was effectively going all in. In other words, Snowy effectively had a 3-bet chipping range all the way up until 27 big blinds deep against a min raise when the button was the min raiser and we were in the big blind. So what I mean by that is I would play around with Snowy, and let's say the big blind was 22 big blinds deep. If the button min raised, the big blind might 3-bet like a pot size 3-bet, but it would never fold to the jam. So for all practical purposes, the big blind was 3-betting all in because the big blind should have just 3-bet all in if it was never going to fold to the button's jam. So that's what I mean by it got messy. Snowy didn't really present it perfectly, but for all practical purposes, Snowy was jamming all the way up until 27 big blinds deep when it was in the big blind and the button min raised. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself, why do you think this is? So again, even when you play with software, it never really tells you why it does what it does. Or at least Snowy doesn't. So you have to actually try to interpret why is Snowy doing what it's doing. So pause for a moment and think, and then I'm going to explain why I think it does what it does. All right. So my thoughts are, think about it a bit. It's 25 big blinds, effective stacks, and the button min raises. What 3-betting size would you use here from the big blind? Again, pause and think. And again, imagine there's no antes, even though antes are going to be a really big deal. All right, so all the options seem bad, right? A small 3-bet sizing gives the button an insane price and still forces us to call often against his jam. I work out the math for it in a minute, but you can intuitively tell, even if we were to 3-bet to like 5 big blinds here, we're already putting in such a huge fraction of our stack, we're going to have to call a jam a lot. And when we 3-bet to only 5 big blinds, the opponent gets an amazing price on the button, and he has position, and yeah, he doesn't have a lot of stack depth, so he can realize his equity really easily. So 3-betting small doesn't seem great. All right, so if we 3-bet to 5 big blinds, we'll be risking 20 big blinds to win 30.5 big blinds on the opponent's jam and only need 39.6% equity to call. So remember, if we do 3-bet from the big blind to only 5 big blinds, we need slightly less than 40% equity and we have to call the button's jam. So, and the last thing to notice, again, I did the math off screen. If our opponent has 33% equity on his jams, so in other words, when the button goes all in and has 33% equity, we'll need to defend at least 54% of the time from the big blind in order to prevent him from just printing money when he jams his 33% equity hands. Now, we should note that this actually seems pretty doable. Like, I don't think it would be that problematic to find, again, we'd have to tweak a whole bunch of stuff, but I don't think it'd be that problematic to make a 3-betting range where, 50 to 60% of the hands we 3-bet would need to call the jam. I don't think that would be the problem with 3-betting small. I think the problem with 3-betting small is it just gives the button such an amazing price. All right, so that's why I don't think 3-betting small from the big blind is ideal. It might still be best, but I don't think it's ideal. But likewise, 3-betting all in seems a bit excessive as we're risking 24 big blinds to win 3.5 big blinds, right? If the button min raises, that's 2 big blinds, small blind's half a big blind, the big blind has 1 big blind dead money, we're risking 24 more big blinds to win 3.5 big blinds. That is a really big jam. So which of these options is best? Do we 3-bet small and give the opponent an awesome price to call, or do we 3-bet all in and make what's basically a massive overbet? We're putting 24 big blinds in the pot to try to win 3.5. Which of these two options is best? And that's when I think maybe, just maybe, it depends on the hand we have. Hands that might 3-bet small would be hands which are strong and okay with having the 3-bet called. So in other words, if I have kings and I 3-bet small and my opponent calls, I'm pretty much okay. I'm just like, don't flop an ace, bro. So that hand might be able to 3-bet small. So maybe 3-betting small with kings is the most profitable thing we can do with it, because we don't really want the opponent to fold, and we're not that afraid of letting our opponent get a flop when we're 25 big blinds deep. Also, maybe we want to 3-bet small with hands which are okay folding to the jam. So hands like king jack off and such. I am guessing here, but a hand like king jack off might be okay to 3-bet small because we can still probably fold it to the jam. But king jack off still does really well against the button opening range, especially if the button's going to fold almost nothing to our super small 3-bet. So like, think about it. Like, I get king jack off is not an awesome hand, but especially if antes were at play, how wide is the button opening? Like, so crazy, silly wide, right? So 3-betting small with king jack off might actually work pretty well, because if we flop a pair, we're good to go. Like, I mean, that pair is going to play very, very well with that stack depth. And, we're going to be 3-betting, our opponent's going to be calling our 3-bet with hands that we do really well against. Like, I imagine he'll just have to call a 3-bet with 10-6 suited. And, king jack off is obviously quite a bit ahead there. So maybe we can 3-bet small with a hand like king jack off that doesn't really hate folding to a jam, even though, of course, we're not happy. And then hands that 3-bet big, in other words, go all in, those would be hands which hate having the 3-bet called and or hate facing the 4-bet. So in other words, I do not want to 3-bet small with ace X suited or ace queen or pocket fives, because then when my opponent jams, I'm probably still going to have to call. But if I'm going to have to call when my opponent jams, why was I 3-betting small to begin with if I hated getting my 3-bet called? Sorry, this stuff's a little... I'm actually saying it correctly, I think. What happens is I know what I want to say, I get it in my head, and then I get excited. So then to make sure I get it out correctly, I talk too fast. So let's not do that. Let me make sure I'm being very clear. We don't want to 3-bet small with hands that can't fold to a jam. So in other words, if our opponent wants to make us go all in, he can anyways. And those hands we 3-bet small with didn't really want to see a flop to begin with. In other words, like if I have, let's say, ace 7 suited or pocket fives, I really don't want to see a flop with pocket fives. Anytime I make my opponent fold, he's almost always going to fold 2 overcards. So if I can't fold, if I 3-bet small and can't fold to my opponent's jam with pocket fives, I might as well just go all in anyways, because I just really, really want to make him fold. And again, if he happens to have pocket nines or whatever, then I was getting stacked anyways. Likewise, let's do ace queen. Again, I haven't worked out the math for this yet. I don't know. But if we jam ace queen, I imagine our opponent's going to have to call with like quite a few hands we dominate. So if he has to call with ace jack or ace 10, yeah, I want it all in right now. And if we just make our opponent fold something like 10-7 suited, then it's like, okay, cool. If our opponent folds 10-7 suited, that's awesome, because that hand was going to outdraw us all the time. Or it might have even just, flopped to draw and then ended up bluffing us off the best hand. Or maybe we just get a really bad flop, have to check fold, and our opponent just bluffs us with absolutely nothing. So it makes sense, I think, to 3-bet all in with ace queen, because we didn't really want to 3-bet small and play that pot, and we couldn't fold anyways if the opponent went all in, so we might as well just jam with ace queen ourselves. So it might not be at 25 big blinds deep, and again, I'm not going to know the answer for this, but I would imagine as you get even deeper, you're probably going to want to start using 2 bet sizes, because you're going to want to have some jamming range, and even if the jam seems excessive, it's just, well, there's not really an ideal option. So you're going to have some jamming range, and then you also might have some small 3-betting range, and which hands go into which range are going to really depend on, does your hand feel okay seeing a flop for a small pot? And does your hand feel okay with facing the 4-bet jam? And the hand might feel okay facing the 4-bet jam like pocket kings do, because we snap call it, or like king jack off, maybe king jack off can just fold and not absolutely hate life. So I do think once you reach a certain stack depth, you stop just jamming, and then you have 2 bet sizing ranges, one where you're jamming and then the other where you actually are making the small 3-bet. So let's talk a little bit about how can 3-betting small make sense if villain never folds, because this to me doesn't seem that intuitive. All right, well, we still make the pot bigger with the likely stronger hand. So king jack off is better than the random button opening hand, and again, this is especially going to be true if there's antes. So in limit, the button opener will never fold to a 3-bet, but the big blind still 3-bets to make the pot bigger with his strong hands. So I think like the same thing's happening here. If we 3-bet really small with a hand like king jack off, we're making the pot bigger when we're probably ahead, the same way we would if it was limit. Even though we know we don't have fold equity, we still want to make the pot bigger when we're ahead of our opponent's range. And then also, we're not going to go talk about it too much. You want to keep in mind that having the stronger range is usually beneficial if you miss. So even though I was talking about king jack off here, I'm open to the idea of 3-betting small with something like, let's say, 6-5 suited, because if we 3-bet small with 6-5 suited and our opponent calls, our range post-flop is going to be much stronger than our opponent's range post-flop, right? Because we're the 3-better, whereas he just called because he was getting an awesome price. So it's possible that 3-betting small with 6-5 suited might be good either in practice or in theory with certain stack depth, because we'll likely get a profitable bluff opportunity post-flop, or the stack depth might work out well that we could bet the flop and ship the turn when we do have some draws, which 6-5 suited is likely to make. Hopefully you can see that the reason why I didn't make a video about this before, and really the only reason why I'm doing it right now, is because I was going to do this on my own because I wanted to get better at tournaments. But the reason why I didn't make this video before is you have to understand so many concepts which themselves can make a video, that it's really hard to make a cohesive half-hour video on this concept and have everything be super clear. Because now I was just talking briefly about how, basically what I was saying is when you have the stronger range, you can still make garbage hands profitable, right? Like if we make a really small 3-bet with 6-5 suited and we flop garbage, our range might be so much stronger than our opponents that we could profitably bet any 2 cards. And that kind of makes up for the fact that we 3-bet, which was, a low equity hand pre-flop. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. Hopefully you can follow most of it. If any of it's confusing, ask me about it in the forums, but there's no real way we can address this concept with just ignoring all that kind of stuff. But it's also really hard to make sure everyone that's watching this video understands that kind of stuff, because all these concepts themselves could make separate videos. Okay. So that was a lot of talk and not a lot of pictures. So what would the ranges we were just talking about actually look like? So now we need to come up with a little scheme to make things click. And first, conceptually, how should a small 3-betting range look like? Well, I think a small 3-betting range should probably be pretty linear, as we're almost never getting folds on our small 3-bets. Again, I'm still open to the idea of 3-betting very small with like the 6-5 suited stuff, but for the most part, the range is going to be pretty linear because we have such little fold equity and we want to make the pot bigger with our stronger hands. The next thing we would do is then work out the math to find out how often we need to call when our opponent 4-bet jams all in, and just call with the best hands in our range. So we already talked about that a little bit earlier. So let's just jump in. When so much stuff needs to come together, I think we're better off just trying to make some ranges and going from there. So let's try discussing some 3-bet jamming ranges and some 3-bet small ranges. We'll talk both in theory and exploitative play. All right, so I'm looking at Poker Snowy, and I have huge blinds, $200 each. So it's effectively like tournaments where people have like over a jillion chips deep and all that kind of stuff. And there is no rake. So that was what's more important here. All right, so rake will pretty much be negligible. And the button min raises. All right, we're 30 big blinds deep to start. Okay, so what you do is the first thing you can look at is pre-flop advice. And it will tell you to make a pot that Snowy, if it can only pick one bet sizing, makes a pot size 3-bet. So let's look at a random hand. Let's look at, let's say, pocket aces. Now we can look, and it says, okay, we should 3-bet aces pre-flop. No surprise there. And it thinks for making a pot size 3-bet, the EV is 9.31 big blinds in EV. Now we can also look to see what it thinks the EV is for a small 3-bet or a giant 3-bet. And here it thinks a pot size 3-bet is best, right? Because 2 times pot has 8.48. 1 pot has 9.31, and 0.5 has 8.55. So that is the largest, the largest EV is for the pot size 3-bet. And do note, it's just estimating the best it can, and the difference between a pot and a half pot size 3-bet is pretty substantial. Half pot's 850, pot's 1300. So it's possible that, the best 3-bet sizing is somewhere in between these two. Maybe it's only like, 1,000 chips or 1,100 chips. We really have no way of knowing. All right, so aces wanted to make a pot size 3-bet. Let's try a different hand. Let's see if we do something like pocket 4s. Let's see what the EV of it is. All right, so it says for a pot size, it says you should use a mixed strategy in the big blind, call 97% of the time, and then raise a pot size bet 3% of the time with pocket fours. And let's see what it does for two pot. All right, so it says two pot has a lower EV of raising than one pot does. So with pocket fours, Snowy again likes only making a pot size bet 3-bet. And I already looked at this, but I'm gonna act surprised. So let me know how well I acted. Now let's try ace queen off, guys. All right, ace queen has an EV of 1.96 big blinds when it makes a pot size bet 3-bet. Let's see about the other sizings. Oh snap! For 2 times the pot, which is basically just going all in, the EV is substantially higher. It's 2.67 big blinds. That's a substantial difference. So with ace queen, we should basically just go all in pre-flop. Let's try another hand that I haven't already pre-selected to prove my point. Let's try ace 2 suited. Ace 2 suited for a pot size bet 3-bet has an EV of 0.95 big blinds. Oh my, when we go all in, or 2 times pot it, which is effectively going all in, it has an EV of 1.21 big blinds. Golly gee, that's higher. Okay, so the last one I want to show is pocket nines. Pocket nines also has a substantially higher EV when it jams than when it calls. And to me that makes sense, because if you go all in with nines, you can probably make the opponent fold some 2 overcard hands. Like that's pretty sweet if he just folds 10 jack or king jack or whatever. So that's cool. And he also probably, I mean, let's look. I don't know. Let's hide this and go all in and see what this dude does with pocket threes. Yeah, he calls. So then also when you go all in with pocket nines, you're guaranteed to stack the lower pocket pair. And apparently it wasn't even close. It's like the snappiest of snap calls. So going all in with nines too can make sense. So I played around with this a little bit more, and honestly, I don't think it's that accurate. I mean, I have no way of knowing, but I don't think it's that accurate. But again, like the general idea that it's telling us kind of backs up like the logic and theory that we just talked about, which is like, hey, there's probably some hands that, you know, if we were to look at our opponent's all-in calling range, there's probably some hands that work a lot better as jams than as small 3-bets. And those seem to be ace queen, which I actually did guess correctly earlier. I was totally guessing that. It seems like it's ace queen, some of the low suited aces, but it mainly showed ace 2 suited. I looked at the other ones and it didn't, but it mainly showed ace 2 suited. But again, I don't think it's that accurate. So I think jamming some of the ace X suited can be fine. And then it also showed the middle pairs, especially nines, but eights were a mixed strategy. The middle pairs also made good jams. So let's visualize that real quickly. Okay, so I made this incredibly impressive Flopzilla range that consists of basically 3 types of hands. It consists of middle pairs, the suited aces, the low suited aces, and then ace queen. Now, just looking at this range, you can already tell, and by the way, I was being sarcastic about it being an impressive range. Hopefully that was clear. I know you guys can't see my face, but you can hopefully tell when you just look at this range, there doesn't really look like there's a counter strategy for this, right? Like we haven't balanced everything and tweaked it all perfectly. And again, there might be mixed strats, but if you knew your opponent, if you're in the button and you know your opponent's 3-bet jamming with this range, it puts you in a really awkward spots with like a lot of hands, right? Like a lot of hands might have to call even though they hate it, or there might be some hands that need to fold even though folding is not ideal either. So even if your opponent knew that you were jamming with this range, there doesn't really seem to be a great counter strategy, right? Because we have the middle pairs, we have the high suited aces, and then we have kind of what I guess I would call the bluff component, which is the suited aces that also have a lot of equity. So yeah, this range looks really good to me. If we're jamming this stuff for 30 big blinds deep, then we can 3-bet small with the other stuff where 3-betting is more profitable than calling. So, I mean, I would just keep looking at Snowy because I think it's interesting. But like, let's see what Snowy says about the suited connectors. I'm guessing it's not going to 3-bet, but I could be wrong. Okay, it calls us and doesn't think it's close. Although if you make a big 3-bet, it does think it's close. All right, so we could look at Snowy and we could use logic to try to figure out what the small 3-betting range should be. But I think it should be pretty obvious to most people. Like there's some stuff that's close, but like mainly the bulk of it's going to be like this kind of stuff, right? Like all the really premium hands that were so strong that we could 3-bet small. Sorry, nines were 3-bet big. That were so strong we could 3-bet small without worrying about our opponent calling because their hand was just that strong. I still think ace king is kind of close. And the other thing you want to keep in mind is this. These ranges are going to change a lot based on changes in stack depth. So earlier when I was making the slides, I was talking about being 25 big blinds deep. For this stuff, I decided to just go 30 big blinds deep because I thought it might be a little bit more interesting to look at in Poker Snowy. But like you would need to know, like if you were trying to play theoretically optimal, you would need to know how to change your range based on all these little changes in stack depth. Do I think that's important here? Not really. So let's kind of pull it all back and sort of sum up what I've taken from this video. The first is, and that probably the most important thing is, I learned you can 3-bet jam a lot deeper than people seem to think is okay. As I said, I would have guessed 20 big blinds deep against a button min raise with no antes. And it looked like, according to Snowy, it was more like 27 big blinds deep. The math seems to support that. So a lot of people are making these small 3-bets with stack depth that really doesn't make a lot of sense. Maybe exploitatively it's good, but from a theoretical perspective, it's probably not because you give the button such an awesome price to call. So that's the first thing I would take from it. The second thing I would take from it is it does seem to be true that as you get deeper, as you approach like 30 big blinds deep, as we get deeper still, you probably start wanting to have 2 3-bet sizings. It doesn't seem really important to balance that and memorize that. I don't really care. Like I would just start, I don't get to play too many tournaments because there's not a lot of tournaments that run on American sites, but it's not something I would worry about if I were playing tournaments. I would just be like, okay, what was the general idea that I took from that is I learned that ace queen, some of the middle pairs and some of the suited aces, those seem like the best hands to jam with for this, like 25 to 30 big blind stack depth. Again, it will change a little bit based on small changes in stack depth, but in general, that seems like a good thing to take from that. Then if I were playing tournaments, I could actually, if I'm playing live, I can see what my opponents are doing and adjust exploitatively. If I'm playing online and I can use a HUD, then I can look at my HUD and go, okay, this guy looks like, I think this guy particularly is going to fold a lot to 3-bets. Or I think, even if I don't have a read, I think most opponents fold too much to the 3-bet all in. I can adjust that slightly and maybe, widen or tighten my range based on that. But the general idea of, hey, what are in a vacuum the best hands to 3-bet all in with, even when you get, deeper, it seems like it's like ace queen, the suited aces, and the middle pairs, which makes a lot of sense to me, and it's something that's just very good to know. Even if I had like a hunch that those were the best hands to 3-bet big with, it's nice to see some software confirm that that looks like that's right. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you took something useful from it. And the last thing I hope people really took from this video is sometimes there just aren't good options in poker, and that doesn't mean you did anything wrong. And a lot of times you're going to have to take a line which isn't ideal and can really backfire. So here, with this jamming range, oh, sorry, let me get it back up real quick. We really were just jamming with hands where it was like, dude, I don't like these lines. Like, I don't like going all in here for 30 big blinds deep. I wish there was something better and more efficient I could do, but it looks like that's just not really the case since the small 3-bet is so not ideal and calling with these hands is so not ideal that it looks like we just need to jam these hands all in. We're picking what we think is the best line out of 3 non-ideal options. And that happens a lot in poker, and it's something you want to get really comfortable with, both for pre-flop and post-flop stuff. All right, so thank you everyone for watching this. Give me your comments and your feedback in the forums, and if anything was unclear, because I know we did touch on a lot of concepts without going into detail, just post it in the thread and I'll try to answer it. So thanks for watching everyone. Good luck. Bye.